Hi Mary, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Alan?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Thanks for joining.
It's a pleasure.
What prompted us to have this call was World Values Day. And World Values Day is all about helping people to really heighten people's awareness and deepen their understanding of their values. And it's really a focus for everybody all over the world to be able to do that. And I'm particularly pleased that we're talking because it seems to me that something that we have in common is this kind of focus on doing it in practice rather than a more theoretical approach.
Right. That's absolutely right. And that's why I felt a resonance right off the bat when we connected about that. I really feel that we've often focused on values and ethics as if it's entirely a question of some sort of decision-making framework, when often it's really about figuring out how to get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe a good place to start is if you could give me a kind of rough sketch of what giving voice to values is.
I'd be pleased to. Giving voice to values, or GVV as I refer to it, is it's an innovative approach to values-driven leadership development. We created it for use in graduate business education, but it's now being used all over the world in businesses and other organizations, as well as in educational settings. The main idea behind it is, as you were just saying, Alan, is when we try and teach about and talk about values and ethics in business situations and in our wider lives, we usually ask, here's a situation, what's the right thing to do? And we approach it as if it's a cognitive problem. But I was increasingly seeing research that suggested that if you really want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal and practice is a very effective way to do that. And so what we did is we created a different pedagogical approach, which focuses not on the question, what's the right thing to do, but focuses on the question, once you know what's right, how do you get it done effectively? And then we created a whole curriculum around that with, it's a new kind of teaching case. It's post-decision making, we call it. And we created, books and videos and online modules and MOOCs and things, and started sharing it widely. Most of it for free, and it's been picked up hugely, much more than we anticipated and much more quickly. And I think it's because, often there are many people who actually would like to act in accordance with their values. They just often don't think they have a real choice. And that's what this is about.
Okay. And it's the bit that really intrigues me is that it's one thing knowing it, but it's an altogether different thing doing it, isn't it?
Exactly. People refer to it as the knowing doing gap.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, oh, go ahead.
No, you go on.
Well, I was going to say, and I think often people, when I interview people about times when they've acted on their values and times when they haven't, and they're clearly people who care about things because they have tried to act at certain points in their lives. So I'll usually ask them, well, so why didn't you when you didn't? And they almost always say some version of, I didn't think I had a choice. It would have been futile. It would have made things worse. I'm the only one who feels this way, et cetera, et cetera. And, so I felt like that's where we really have some traction, is to begin to unpack some of those, I call them the starting assumptions, to begin unpacking some of those starting assumptions and helping people find out, you're not actually always alone here, but you're never going to know you're not alone unless you start talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've reminded me, just recently I was speaking to a guy who was involved in an assessment of a business. And the assessment was done and it came for him to put his signature to it. But he didn't feel that the assessment had the rigor that he really felt that it should have. But he was one of many that was signing it off. And so there was a lot of pressure on him to just sign it off. And he was telling me that he had to pluck up a lot of courage and eventually said, I'm not going to put my name to this. And if you want to proceed without my name on it, that's fine, but I'm not going to put my name to it. And as a result of that, they asked him, well, why not? And he explained why not. And the long story short, they did something that was far more robust and detailed as a result. And afterwards, they said, we thought you were being really awkward at the time, but now we've been through it all again, we realise that that's added enormous value. So thrilled to bits, going from this nervous wreck of can I really do this, to being praised for it.
Right, right. That's a great story. That's a great GVV story. That's the kind of story that we turn into case studies. The one thing I would add is that if you're using the Giving Voice to Values curriculum or pedagogy, one of the things we would help people figure out is that sometimes if you start raising questions earlier in the process, you don't have to get to that point where it's like, oh my God, I'm the only one and I'm gonna, have to stop the process at the 11th hour. So one of the things we do is help people figure out all the places you can intervene and the ways you can intervene, because sometimes you have to just pluck up your courage and do what that gentleman did. But what we want to do is actually help this be easier, and help people realize, it doesn't always have to be this big moral stand. Sometimes if we can intervene in the process, it can be more of a problem-solving exercise rather than a defining moment of moral character.
Sure. And the other bit that is coming through here for me is this thing about how practice makes things easier. So that guy in that situation, should that happen again, he's going to find it altogether more easy to do the same thing than he did the first time. And it's a very, very simple concept, I guess, but it is just so powerful that if you go ahead and do something, it will be easier the next time. That's kind of the fundamental philosophy behind the My 31 Practices approach, which is just encouraging people to identify their core values and then to identify day-to-day practices that are explicitly connected to those values, and then simply to practice them, but in a conscious way.
Right, right. And to rehearse, I mean, that's the resonance, I think, between your approach and my approach. And part of the rehearsal is also to do it in a social context so that you can rehearse coaching each other, because then we've kind of given you permission to think creatively about how you would act on your values. So you kind of have cover to talk about the difficult issues before they're actually difficult issues. So it becomes more of a kind of, as I call it, a moral muscle memory. It becomes more of a default behavior. And it's not just practice too. It's also informed by the examples, what we've learned about, there's a predictable set of rationalizations and arguments and objections that you might encounter. And because they're predictable, you can also work in a calmer moment on figuring out, how would I reframe that? How would I respond to that? How could I persuade someone? So you really do turn it into a management and communication problem-solving exercise, which makes it less stressful, less emotional.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that, in terms of the neuroscience behind this, the way that it was described to me as a layperson, which I love it, is it was described like you're in jungle and you've got a machete. And so if you make a path with the machete, but then you leave it, the growth will come back again and the path will disappear. Whereas if you make the path and make the path and make the path, eventually the undergrowth will leave the path there and will grow away. And that was described to me as being, that's the way that you're really conditioning your own behavior through practice.
That's right. You're sort of creating, in the neuroscience sense, you're creating a new neural pathway,
Exactly.
The other thing that I think is interesting from a research perspective, is not just the neuroscience of it, but also a lot of the social psychology research that looks at the ways that we often will act first out of a kind of instinctive emotional response, as is, Kahneman and Tversky, and as opposed to reasoning. Most ethical approaches are decision-making models, and you reason through something and then act. And what they find is that's not how people live. You kind of act emotionally and then you reason through it post hoc to make it make sense to you, which is why the rationalizations are so powerful. So one of the reasons why your approach and my approach, I think, are so effective is that you're interrupting that cycle. You're interrupting that cycle where you're unconsciously behaving out of an emotional response and then later rationalizing it post hoc. You're actually giving people a chance to create an alternative sort of first response.
Yes,
The anxiety they feel about and the belief they might feel at an unconscious level that this isn't possible. You've started to unpack that so that it becomes a different sort of pattern, a different instinct. So it kind of works at both the neuroscience level and the social psychology level. And then, of course, the social aspect of it. You do all the practices in a social context. We do GVV in a social context. That only reinforces it.
Absolutely. Okay. Now, there's one question I have to ask you, because you refer to values and ethics. So what's the difference?
Well, different people may answer it differently, but I will tell you how I think of the difference.
Okay.
You've noticed that my work is called Giving Voice to Values, not Giving Voice to Ethics.
Yeah.
And that was intentional because the way, codes of ethics, ethical regulations, our various corporate policies and value statements, the law, all of those kinds of systems, codified systems of ethics, or even professional ethics, the code of ethics for a physician or for an attorney, etc., or for engineers, they tend to be external. They tend to be external, systematic models, frameworks that have been created to guide our decision making in the particular context. They're hugely important, right? They help us to reason clearly. They help us to understand where the boundaries of acceptable behavior are. They help us communicate, and they also help us monitor and even even take punitive action when necessary. But they don't necessarily motivate. And so I think of values more as, based on the research that suggests that even though there are cultural differences and personal differences, that there tend to be a core set of values that are pretty much widely shared. The philosophers call them hypernorms.
Yeah.
It's a very short list of high-level values, things like integrity and compassion, etc., fairness. And the thing is that those are the things that we kind of have an instinctive sort of affinity for, or we will instinctively feel that something isn't fair. We will instinctively have a sense of empathy or compassion that's triggered by certain kinds of events or certain kinds of things we may witness. And so what I wanted to do was to find a way to present values-driven action as something that's coming from within, that's more aspirational rather than this external constriction placed on you. And my reason for doing that is because this all grew out of business school environments and corporate environments. And what I learned from working with these, very talented managers and future business leaders is that they really didn't enjoy constraints on action. They were motivated by a sense of can do, let's be innovative, let's solve the problems. And so I wanted to frame ethical behavior and values-driven behavior as an exercise where they got to use their innovative thinking, their creative problem solving, where they were linking it to something that they felt a motivation toward, rather than constantly saying, well, you can't go there and you can't go there.
Yeah.
And so instead of showing that you're smart by figuring out the way around the rules, we're asking them to show they're smart by figuring out a way to behave ethically and still be effective.
Okay. So would you say that, to kind of try and paraphrase that then, is it about ethics being something that you should do according to others, whereas values are what you believe in and want to do yourself?
Well, I'm not going to say according to others, because often ethical rules actually are an extension of, an elaboration of even my own values, right? It's just that they're more technical and they are seen as external.
Yeah.
And so what I want to do is to tap into the internal aspirational quality, which will then maybe enable me to be able to act in accordance with the code of ethics of my profession. But there's a motivation in it that it's an impetus in it that I wouldn't necessarily feel if I framed it as a constraint or a boundary, as opposed to framing it as an opportunity to creatively get to the positive endpoint.
Okay.